The gift of freedom. Marcus Thompson had always dreamed of a bike like the one his father had just gifted him for his 14th birthday. It wasn't just any bike. It was sleek, shiny, and an undeniable symbol of everything Marcus had worked for. The frame shimmered in the sunlight, a deep blue that glinted with hints of silver. It was the kind of bike you could only dream about, something that screamed independence and adventure. For Marcus, it wasn't just about the bike. It was about what it represented. The pride in his father's eyes as he handed him the gift meant more than the shiny new wheels. It was an acknowledgement of his hard work, the grades he had earned, and the quiet ways he had taken on responsibilities that far exceeded his years. School had never been easy, especially as one of the few black students in an all-white suburban school, but Marcus had persevered. His father's encouragement, even when times were tough, had been the constant light that guided him through difficult moments. The day Marcus got the bike was a reminder of how far he had come. His father's smile as he handed over the keys was priceless. "You earned this, son," his dad had said. But remember, with freedom comes responsibility. It wasn't a new lesson for Marcus, but it was one he held close. His father had always told him that he would have to work twice as hard to prove himself, to be seen for who he was, not just the color of his skin. It was a tough pill to swallow at times, but Marcus had learned to carry it with him like armor. That morning, Marcus dressed in his new clothes, a set of bright sneakers, a cool hoodie, and jeans that fit just right. He couldn't wait to ride his new bike around the neighborhood, feeling the wind in his hair as he rode down streets he had walked so many times. The sun was shining, the air was warm, and everything seemed perfect. He rolled out of the driveway, his heart racing with excitement. The streets of his neighborhood were alive, as usual. Kids were playing hopscotch on the sidewalks, neighbors were chatting on their porches, and the occasional car would pass by, with drivers waving casually. The world felt small and safe, or at least that's what Marcus tried to convince himself. But even on days like this, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that things were different for him. His father had reminded him often enough that as a black boy, the world saw him through a different lens, one that sometimes colored his every interaction, even when everything seemed calm. As he pedaled down the street, Marcus was careful. He knew the importance of staying alert. It wasn't just the usual worries a 14-year-old might have about falling off his bike or losing control. No, Marcus carried a deeper sense of caution, one rooted in a harsh reality that his white friends didn't have to face. He often felt the weight of his father's words echoing in his head. You need to be smarter, more aware, and most of all, respectful, because some people will never see you as just a kid. Turning a corner toward a quieter part of the neighborhood, Marcus misjudged the narrowness of the street. His new bike swerved, and his front tire brushed up against the side mirror of a parked police patrol car. The soft scrape made Marcus's heart drop into his stomach. The sound, though faint, was enough to make his pulse race. He stopped immediately and dismounted his bike, dread building in his chest. He moved quickly to inspect the mirror, hoping there was no visible damage. The glass was only slightly smudged, a minor thing, really. Marcus exhaled, relief washing over him. He straightened up and began to move away from the car when he heard the unmistakable sound of a car door opening behind him. The officer inside the patrol car had noticed. At first, Marcus thought the officer might just acknowledge the accident and move on. But as he turned to look, he saw the officer stepping out of the car, his uniform stiff and crisp, his demeanor shifting as he took in the scene. Marcus froze. The officer, a tall, burly man with a stern face, had been looking at the car, but as his eyes shifted to Marcus, they narrowed. For a moment, Marcus felt like he was standing in front of a judge, awaiting a verdict. His gaze locked with the officer's, and he could see something in the cop's eyes that unsettled him. The shift in the officer's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. It was like the officer saw Marcus not just as a kid who had made a mistake, but as something more. A threat? A problem? Marcus couldn't tell. "Hey, you. Stop right there," the officer called out, his voice loud and commanding. Marcus flinched, his heart racing. What had he done wrong? He hadn't broken anything, had he? He stood frozen beside his bike, unsure of what to do. The officer's voice, now filled with authority and anger, sent a chill down his spine. For a split second, Marcus wondered if he should try to explain himself, to tell the officer about the scrape, but something told him that wouldn't matter. His black skin, his age, and the bike. All of it seemed to be under scrutiny in that moment. The officer, now closer, looked him up and down. His eyes lingered on the bright clothes Marcus wore and the shiny new bike. Marcus felt exposed. He had worn these clothes to feel good about himself, to enjoy the day, but now they felt like a glaring mark against him. The officer's gaze sharpened as he took in the entire scene. "What's your name, kid?" the officer barked. "Marcus," he stammered, his throat dry. "Marcus Thompson." The officer's eyes flicked toward his patrol car, then back at Marcus. He didn't seem to care that Marcus was a kid just trying to enjoy his birthday. The officer's focus had shifted, and it was now all about Marcus. What had started as a minor scrape against a parked car was quickly escalating into something much more dangerous. For Marcus, this moment was all too familiar. He had seen it before, on the news, in his father's warnings, in the stories of other black boys who had faced the wrath of the system. They were always seen as a threat first. In this moment, Marcus realized just how quickly everything could change. What had started as an innocent bike ride had just turned into a dangerous encounter with the law. But what Marcus didn't know was that the officer was about to make a grave mistake, one that would set off a chain of events that no one, not even Marcus's father, could have predicted. And in those next moments, everything Marcus had ever been taught about justice, power, and standing up for what was right would be put to the ultimate test. The officer's choice. Marcus stood motionless, heart pounding in his chest. The officer's gaze was no longer just a casual look. It was a piercing stare that seemed to judge him entirely. There was something in the officer's eyes that Marcus had seen before. It wasn't just the professional disapproval one might expect from an authority figure. It was something deeper, something much more personal. He could feel the tension growing, his throat dry, his palms sweaty. He had no idea what to do next. Should he speak up? Should he explain? Would it matter? His father's words echoed in his mind. Be respectful, always. But don't let anyone treat you like you're less than who you are. But in this moment, Marcus wasn't sure if respect would be enough. The officer, whose name tag read Randall, continued to eye him with a mix of confusion and suspicion, as though Marcus had somehow crossed an invisible line. The air felt thick with unspoken words, the space between them charged with a quiet, uncomfortable tension. Marcus, still standing beside his bike, felt like he was being judged not just for the minor scrape against the patrol car, but for everything he was, every assumption made about him before he even had a chance to speak. "Do you know how much that car costs?" Officer Randall asked, his voice suddenly cold. His words, sharp and accusing, seemed to hang in the air between them. Marcus swallowed. He wasn't sure if the question was rhetorical, but it wasn't one he knew how to answer. The price of a patrol car was far beyond anything he could comprehend, but in that moment, it didn't matter. The officer's tone suggested that the bike, a simple gift his father had given him to celebrate his birthday, was somehow a threat, something to be feared or resented. "I didn't mean to," Marcus said, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. "It was just an accident." The officer didn't respond right away. He took a slow step forward, his boots scraping against the pavement with each movement. Marcus felt his breath hitch as the officer's gaze never wavered from him. It was like a silent standoff, one that Marcus had never wanted to experience. "Accident," Officer Randall repeated, his tone growing more incredulous. "You think I'm going to believe that? Look at you, with your shiny new bike and fancy clothes. What do you think you're doing, showing off around here?" Marcus's stomach dropped. The accusation hung in the air like a shadow, dark and heavy. He wanted to argue, to explain how hard he had worked for everything he had. But something in the officer's eyes told him it wouldn't matter. In that moment, Marcus realized that his worth wasn't going to be determined by his actions or his intentions. It was being decided by the officer's assumptions. Officer Randall moved closer, and Marcus instinctively took a small step back. He wasn't afraid of the officer. He had grown up with a deep understanding of the law and what it represented. But fear was something different. Fear was knowing that no matter what he said, he was always going to be judged by the color of his skin before anything else. And that was a kind of fear he had learned to carry with him every day. "Listen," Marcus began, his voice firming up despite the growing anxiety in his chest. "I didn't break anything. I was just riding my bike. I don't mean any trouble." The officer's eyes narrowed further. He was looking at Marcus like he was a problem to be solved, not a person. Marcus could feel the distance growing between them, not just physically but emotionally. What had started as a simple mistake, a kid accidentally brushing a bike against a parked car, was now becoming something else entirely. It felt like the officer was searching for something to charge him with, something to punish him for. "Why don't you bite the rat?" Officer Randall asked suddenly, his voice dripping with malice. The words hung in the air for a long moment before Marcus even fully processed what had been said. His heart skipped a beat as he realized what the officer was referring to. To his right, behind a nearby dumpster, was a small bundle of something wrapped in old newspaper. It didn't take long for Marcus to recognize it. The rat. It was dead, its lifeless body wrapped in the scraps of paper, as if it had been discarded without a second thought. Marcus's eyes widened in horror as the officer's command lingered in the air like a cruel joke. The officer wasn't joking, though. His posture was tense, his face hard and unmoving, waiting for Marcus to respond. It wasn't a question. It was a command. "Bite the rat," Officer Randall repeated, stepping closer to Marcus. His voice was cold, carrying an undercurrent of something far more sinister than just authority. Marcus recoiled, his mind racing. The words felt like a punch to the gut. He couldn't understand why the officer would say something like that. Why would anyone, especially a person of authority, make such an outlandish demand? But the look in Officer Randall's eyes told him that this wasn't an idle threat or an odd request. It was a test, a challenge. A challenge to his dignity, to his very humanity. "No," Marcus said, his voice shaky but resolute. "I won't do that." The officer's expression darkened, his features tightening with visible contempt. For a moment, Marcus felt like he had made a terrible mistake, as though the officer would lash out in anger. But then something unexpected happened. The officer stepped back, as if assessing Marcus with new eyes. The confrontation, which had seemed to be escalating towards something much worse, suddenly shifted. "I don't think you understand," Officer Randall said slowly, his voice low. "You're not going to get away with just this. You think you can disrespect me and get away with it. Think again." Marcus's stomach twisted. He had no idea where this was going, but he felt the weight of every word as though they were lead weights on his chest. He wasn't sure if the officer was serious about making him bite the rat, but he knew this moment was something much larger than any mistake or misstep he had made. Before Marcus could respond, the sound of a car engine broke through the tension. A second patrol car pulled up, its lights flashing. The officer paused, his attention shifting to the new arrival. The door to the car opened, and a second officer stepped out. This one was younger, his expression more confused than angry, and for the briefest of moments, Marcus saw something like relief in his eyes. The new officer had clearly arrived in time to defuse whatever was about to happen. "What's going on here?" the new officer asked, his gaze darting between Marcus and Officer Randall. Randall didn't answer immediately. His face was still set, but there was something in his posture, something shifting, that told Marcus he was no longer in control of the situation. "This kid's got some attitude," Randall said after a beat, his voice laced with frustration. "He thinks he can just do whatever he wants around here." The new officer looked at Marcus, his eyes softer, more understanding. Without saying a word, He walked over to the dumpster, checking the scene, making sure there was no immediate danger or threat. Marcus stood still, his heart pounding, knowing that whatever happened next could change everything. He had no idea that the presence of the second officer would set into motion a chain of events far beyond what he could have ever imagined. And little did Marcus know, his life was about to take a turn that would forever change the way he saw the world. And the way the world saw him. The unraveling truth. The new officer, who had just arrived, was looking at Marcus with a far more neutral expression than Officer Randall. His brow furrowed slightly as he surveyed the scene, but there was no anger in his eyes. In fact, there was a look of confusion, as though he wasn't sure how things had escalated this far. "All right, let's all just take a step back," the new officer said, his voice calm and even. He stepped between Randall and Marcus, raising his hand in a peaceful gesture. "What's going on here?" Randall's face remained hard, but there was a momentary flicker of uncertainty. He hesitated for a moment, looking at Marcus like a chess player who had just lost his move. For the first time, Marcus saw a crack in Randall's armor, a sign that the officer wasn't entirely convinced of the righteousness of his actions. "I told him to bite the rat," Randall said tersely, his tone still sharp, but the words were now more defensive than commanding. "He disrespected me, and he needs to learn some humility." Marcus's stomach twisted into a knot, but he held his ground. He had been taught to never back down when his dignity was at stake. Still, as the seconds ticked by, he couldn't shake the feeling that this whole situation was spiraling out of control. What had started as a simple mistake, an accidental brush against a parked car, had turned into something much darker, something that threatened to strip away his sense of security and justice. The new officer glanced at Marcus, then back at Randall. His expression softened slightly, though he didn't seem entirely convinced of Randall's rationale. "A rat, huh?" he repeated slowly, his tone laced with disbelief. He shook his head, glancing briefly at the dead rodent wrapped in the newspaper. "This is how we're handling things now." Marcus didn't know whether to feel relieved or more terrified. The second officer wasn't entirely siding with him, but he wasn't on Randall's side either. This seemed like a glimmer of hope, though it was still unclear where this situation was heading. "Look," Randall said, his voice rising a little in frustration. "This kid was being disrespectful. He's out here in the neighborhood, flaunting his new bike like some kind of show-off. I can't just let that go unchallenged." He glared at Marcus again, his jaw tightening. Marcus wanted to argue, to tell the officer that he wasn't trying to show off, that the bike was a gift from his father, a symbol of everything he had worked hard for. But something told him it wouldn't matter. The officer's bias was already clear. This wasn't about the bike. It wasn't even about the small scrape against the mirror. It was about something deeper, something far more ingrained in how people like Marcus were viewed in the world. "I didn't do anything wrong," Marcus said, his voice steady, despite the anger that was building inside him. "I didn't disrespect anyone. I didn't break anything. I was just riding my bike." The second officer turned to Randall, his expression a mix of disbelief and concern. "Randall, you can't be serious. This isn't how we handle things. We're here to protect the community, not humiliate a kid for riding his bike." The tension between the two officers was palpable now. Randall stood rigid, his hands clenched at his sides, while the new officer was clearly trying to defuse the situation. But Marcus couldn't help but feel that this might be the first time someone was actually questioning Randall's behavior in a meaningful way. That realization filled Marcus with a strange sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance this wouldn't escalate into something worse. For a few seconds, there was a silence as the two officers exchanged looks. Randall's posture began to relax ever so slightly, but Marcus could feel the anger still simmering beneath the surface. He wasn't off the hook just yet. "Maybe we should just call it a day, Randall," the second officer said, his voice calm, but with an underlying firmness. "This isn't worth our time. Let the kid go." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea if this officer had any real power to stop what Randall had started. The more he thought about it, the more he realized just how complicated this situation had become. Officer Randall seemed like the kind of man who wouldn't easily back down, and it was still unclear if his partner had the authority to intervene. But in that moment, Marcus saw something in the new officer's eyes, a flicker of compassion, of understanding. Something that wasn't just about enforcing the law, but about recognizing the humanity of the people he interacted with. It was something Marcus had never fully experienced with a cop before. Finally, Randall seemed to relent, his shoulders dropping slightly as he exhaled sharply. "Fine," he muttered, barely looking at Marcus. "I'll let it go. But you better remember this, kid. Don't make a habit of it." He shot a final glare at Marcus, then turned and walked back to his patrol car. The second officer watched him go, then turned to Marcus, his expression softening. "You okay, kid?" he asked, his tone more sympathetic than anything Marcus had heard all day. Marcus nodded, though he felt far from okay. His legs were still trembling, and his heart was racing from the adrenaline of the past few minutes. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but it felt like he had narrowly escaped something far worse. "Yeah," Marcus said, though his voice betrayed his anxiety. "I'm fine." The second officer gave him a small, reassuring nod. "Good. You don't deserve to be treated like that. Trust me, I know the difference between a kid just being a kid and someone trying to cause trouble." Marcus looked up at him, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" The officer sighed deeply, his expression troubled. "Look, I've been doing this job for a while now. And sometimes, more often than I'd like to admit, there's an expectation that certain people need to be treated differently. You've seen it, right? People who look like you, they get handled a lot harsher than people who look like me." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. For the first time, it was as if someone was acknowledging the unspoken truth that he had grown up with. He had always known it, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way he had never anticipated. Before he could say anything, the officer glanced at his radio and then back at Marcus. "Listen, I'm going to make sure nothing else happens. You should be safe to go on your way. But if you ever need anything, if you ever feel like things are getting out of hand again, don't hesitate to ask for me. My name's Officer Green." "Marcus," he replied, his voice quiet but grateful. "Stay safe, Marcus," Officer Green said, giving him one last look. "And keep your head up." As Marcus watched Officer Green walk back to his car, he felt a mixture of emotions flood through him. On one hand, he was thankful that he hadn't been forced to endure something far worse at the hands of Officer Randall. But on the other hand, the entire encounter had left him shaken. The truth was, Marcus knew that his experience with law enforcement was never going to be the same as his white friend's experiences, in a way that had been made clear today. He picked up his bike and started to pedal away, his thoughts swirling with a mix of fear and confusion. There were still so many questions left unanswered, but there was one thing Marcus knew for sure. His life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. And soon, the revelation of just who his father was would come into play, shocking not only the officers involved but revealing a deeper truth about power, influence, and justice that Marcus had yet to realize. Unseen forces at play. The day had taken a turn Marcus hadn't been able to fully grasp. What had started as an ordinary birthday, a ride through his familiar neighborhood with his brand new bike, now felt like a distant memory. The bright sun, the laughter, the freedom, all of it seemed so far away in the haze of what had just transpired. The encounter with Officer Randall had shaken him to the core. And while Officer Green's intervention had offered a sliver of hope, it didn't erase the unsettling feeling that lingered in Marcus's chest. As he pedaled away from the scene, the weight of everything he had just experienced pressed down on him. His thoughts were racing, fragmented thoughts of his father, the police, the way the officer had treated him. What had he really done wrong? A slight scrape against the patrol car. A mistake that, in any other circumstance, would have been an easy fix, a simple apology, and a walk away. But this wasn't just a mistake. This was about something deeper, something that had nothing to do with the bike or the car, but everything to do with who Marcus was and how others saw him. As Marcus turned down his street, his mind wandered to the one person who always seemed to know what to do in situations like this: his father. His father, Charles Thompson, had never been one to shy away from difficult conversations. For years, Charles had told Marcus about the challenges he would face simply because of the color of his skin. His father had been a role model, a figure of strength and wisdom, but he had also been very honest about the realities of the world Marcus was growing up in. No amount of success or hard work would change the way some people saw him. Marcus had always understood that, but today had brought it home in a way he wasn't prepared for. The look in Officer Randall's eyes, the unspoken judgment, had been unmistakable. But what Marcus didn't know was that his father, a quiet man by nature, had a connection to the world that Marcus had never fully understood. Charles Thompson wasn't just a proud father. He was also an FBI agent, one who had worked his way up through the ranks with years of dedication, sacrifice, and an unyielding sense of justice. As Marcus pulled his bike into the driveway, he noticed his father's car wasn't in its usual spot. His heart sank. He had hoped to talk things through with his dad, to get some perspective on what had happened, but it seemed his father was not home. Marcus knew his father had a demanding job, but that didn't stop the sinking feeling in his stomach. The situation with Officer Randall wasn't something he could easily dismiss, and without his father's counsel, he wasn't sure who else he could turn to for clarity. Inside, the house was quiet. It was a feeling Marcus was used to, a peaceful kind of quiet that came with being the only child in a house where both parents worked hard to make sure he had every opportunity in the world. But today, the silence felt heavy, and the weight of his encounter with the police seemed to hang in the air like a dark cloud. Marcus walked into the kitchen and found his mother, Karen, sitting at the table, a cup of tea in front of her. She looked up as he entered, her smile quickly fading when she saw the expression on his face. She had known something was wrong the moment he walked in, but Marcus didn't have the energy to hide it. His mother had always been his rock, the one who provided comfort and wisdom when things got tough, but today he didn't feel like talking. Not yet. "Marcus," she said softly, noticing the bike helmet in his hand and the tension in his posture. "What happened?" He dropped the helmet on the kitchen counter and slumped into the chair across from her. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out immediately. Instead, he simply stared down at his hands, unsure of how to start. He had so many questions swirling in his mind, but none of them felt right to ask. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he looked up at his mother. "I was just riding my bike, Mom," he said quietly. "I brushed against a police car, just a little scrape on the mirror. And this officer, Officer Randall, he got so angry. He started yelling at me, telling me to bite a dead rat." The words felt strange as they left his mouth, but they were the truth. It felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare, but it had happened. Karen's expression shifted from concern to a flicker of something else, something Marcus couldn't quite place. She reached across the table and placed her hand on his, her touch warm and reassuring. "I'm so sorry, Marcus," she said softly. "But you know you have to be careful, especially around the police. They don't always see you the way we see you." Marcus nodded, but it wasn't enough. He wanted to understand why. Why had this officer treated him like that? Why had his mere presence seemed to provoke such hostility? The question gnawed at him, but the answer seemed elusive, tangled up in things he wasn't old enough to fully understand. Before he could say more, the sound of the front door opening interrupted them. Charles stepped inside, his expression immediately alert when he saw Marcus sitting at the table with his mother. He knew something was wrong. "Marcus, what happened?" Charles asked, his voice steady but filled with the kind of concern that only a father could convey. Marcus hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether to repeat what had just happened or to spare his father the frustration he would undoubtedly feel. But he knew that hiding the truth would only cause more harm. "Dad, I had an encounter with a cop. He got mad at me for accidentally scratching his patrol car, and then told me to bite a rat, like it was some kind of punishment," Marcus said, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. Charles's face hardened, his jaw tightening as he processed the words. He had heard the stories, of course. The tragic news stories, the whispered conversations, and the experiences of other black families who had suffered at the hands of law enforcement. He had seen it all before in his line of work, but this was different. This was his son. "Which officer?" Charles asked, his voice sharp now. "Officer Randall," Marcus said, glancing up at his father. "He was the one who kept yelling at me." Charles exhaled slowly, his fingers pressing against his temples as he took in the information. "I see," he muttered under his breath. "I know you don't want me to get involved," Marcus continued, sensing the shift in his father's demeanor. "But I need to understand why he acted like that. Why did he treat me that way?" Charles paused for a moment, his mind working through the situation as he carefully chose his words. "Marcus, I need you to understand something," he began, his voice steady. "There are times when people in positions of authority, people like Officer Randall, don't see you for who you are. They see you through the lens of their own biases, their own misconceptions, and sometimes that leads them to act in ways that are unjust, even cruel." Marcus nodded, but the weight of his father's words didn't make him feel any better. He had heard those words before, but hearing them now, after what had happened, made them feel more like a harsh reality he had no choice but to face. "Listen, I know it's hard to understand now," Charles said, his tone softening. "But this isn't the first time something like this has happened, and it won't be the last. People like Randall, they see a black kid and they make assumptions. But that's not your fault, Marcus. It never will be." Marcus could feel the weight of his father's words settle over him. His father's work with the FBI had always been something of a mystery to him, but it wasn't until now, with the tension from his encounter still hanging in the air, that he truly realized how much his father knew about the world, the real world, and the challenges that came with it. "I can't make it go away," Charles continued, "but I can teach you how to handle these moments. You are not powerless. You are not invisible. And most importantly, you have a voice that deserves to be heard." As Marcus listened to his father's words, a small seed of determination began to grow inside him. He hadn't done anything wrong, and the way he was treated was not a reflection of who he was. It was a reflection of a larger system, one that needed to change, and perhaps, just perhaps, his family, his father's experience in the FBI, could help him navigate this world in ways he had never imagined. But what Marcus didn't know was that this was only the beginning. The forces that had been set into motion by that chance encounter with Officer Randall were about to reveal truths about his family, his father, and the powerful networks that had been quietly watching Marcus all along. A hidden world of power. The night had fallen quietly around the Thompson household. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, his mind still buzzing with everything that had happened. His father's words, though comforting, had also planted the seeds of something far more complicated in his mind. Charles had always been the pillar of calm in their family, a man who seemed to navigate the world with purpose and wisdom. But today, for the first time, Marcus realized there was much more to his father than he had ever known. As he looked out the window, watching the stars flicker quietly in the night sky, Marcus felt the weight of the events of the day pressing in on him. He could no longer ignore the questions that were gnawing at the back of his mind. Why had Officer Randall treated him that way? Why had he been so quick to escalate the situation, to demand something as absurd and degrading as the rat? And why had the other officer, Officer Green, intervened the way he had? Marcus wasn't naive. He understood that there were injustices in the world, that people sometimes acted out of fear, ignorance, or hatred. But today had shown him that the world wasn't as simple as he had once thought. It was murky, full of unseen forces, Forces that could change a situation in an instant, forces that could make a single moment feel like an eternity. As he sat in silence, the sound of footsteps on the front porch broke his train of thought. The door creaked open, and his father stepped inside. He looked tired but composed as usual. The long hours at the FBI often left him exhausted, but he never showed it. Marcus could see that his father was different tonight, though. His posture was a little straighter, his expression more serious. It was as if something had shifted in him, something he hadn't shared yet. "Marcus," Charles said, his voice low and calm. "I need to talk to you." Marcus turned to face him, his heart rate picking up. He had a sense that whatever his father was about to say would change everything. "What's going on, Dad?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Charles took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Marcus's with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "I think it's time I told you a little more about what I do, what we do, about the world you're living in, and the things that you're going to have to face." Marcus's stomach churned. He had always known his father was involved in important work, but he had never understood the full scope of it. As a young boy, he had been proud of his father's work with the FBI. But now, with the events of the day unfolding in his mind, he wondered just how much of his life had been shaped by his father's invisible presence in the world. "What do you mean?" Marcus asked, his voice quiet. Charles took a seat at the table across from him, his hands resting on the wooden surface. There was something in his eyes, something Marcus had never seen before. It was a mix of concern and resolve. What happened today, what happened with that officer, wasn't just about a mistake. It was about something deeper, something you haven't had to confront yet, but you will. It's about the systems of power that have been in place for a long time. Systems that shape how people see you, how they treat you. It's about privilege, bias, and the way the world works in ways you don't always get to see. Marcus frowned, confused, and a little overwhelmed. "What are you talking about, Dad?" Charles leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering even further. "I've worked in law enforcement for years, Marcus. I've seen the corruption, the biases, and the systems that perpetuate inequality. But I'm not just an agent. I've been involved in something far more complex, something that you don't know about." Marcus's pulse quickened. He had never heard his father speak like this before. "What do you mean? What's all this about?" Charles hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Your mother and we've protected you from the worst of it. But the truth is, we've been part of something bigger than just a father protecting his son. The FBI isn't just about catching criminals or solving cases. Sometimes it's about understanding and navigating power in ways that most people never will." Marcus's mind was reeling. This wasn't just about a miscommunication with a cop anymore. It was about something far more intricate, something that involved his own family and the networks his father was part of. But what was his father trying to say? "I don't understand," Marcus said, his voice tight. "What do you mean, part of something bigger? You're an FBI agent, Dad. What's going on?" Charles sighed and rubbed his temples, as if the weight of the conversation had finally caught up with him. The world isn't as simple as it seems. The fight for justice isn't just about right and wrong. Sometimes it's about understanding the systems that shape those definitions, the people who control them, and the ways in which they affect real lives. The FBI isn't just a law enforcement agency. It's also about influence, about understanding the dynamics of power at the highest levels. There are things you don't know, Marcus. Things that you'll need to understand as you grow older. Marcus's mind raced. His father had always been a hero in his eyes, an unflappable protector, a man who had a deep sense of right and wrong. But now he was telling Marcus that there were forces in play that he couldn't even begin to fathom. The very system that was meant to uphold justice had its own hidden agendas, its own biases, and its own set of rules. "But why didn't you ever tell me about this?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with a mixture of hurt and confusion. Charles looked away for a moment, his gaze distant. When he finally spoke again, his voice was softer. "I wanted to protect you from it. I wanted you to have a childhood where you didn't have to think about these things. I wanted you to believe that the world was a fair place, where if you worked hard, you'd be treated right. But the truth is, Marcus, the world doesn't work like that. You need to understand what's happening around you, not just in terms of the police or the law, but in the way that power structures affect your life. Marcus sat back in his chair, the weight of his father's words sinking in. The world wasn't what he had thought it was. He had grown up in a family that valued fairness, honesty, and hard work. But now, those ideals seemed more complicated. His father was telling him that the systems in place weren't designed for him to succeed, no matter how hard he tried. His race, his identity, and even his very existence were filtered through a lens of suspicion, fear, and, in some cases, hatred. But why didn't you tell me before? Why keep all of this from me? Marcus asked, his voice strained. I didn't want to burden you with it, Charles replied. You were too young. You didn't need to know it yet. But now it's different. You're old enough to understand that the world isn't just about following the rules. It's about navigating them in a way that ensures your survival. And sometimes, Marcus, the right thing isn't the easiest thing. There are battles we fight in silence, and there are times when we have to make hard choices. This is one of those times. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. His father wasn't just teaching him about right and wrong anymore. He was teaching him about survival, about how to navigate a world that wasn't going to give him the same chances it gave others. And that scared him more than anything. I don't know what to do with all of this, Dad, Marcus said, his voice small. I just wanted to ride my bike. Charles placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. I know, but you have to understand that there will be times when you'll need to do more than just ride your bike. There will be times when you'll need to speak out, to fight back. You'll need to use your voice, your strength, your wisdom. The conversation had taken a turn that Marcus hadn't been prepared for. The world he had known, the one his father had worked so hard to shield him from, was slowly unraveling before him. And though he didn't have all the answers yet, he knew this was only the beginning. His father's role in the FBI, the quiet power he held, and the truths about the world Marcus was starting to uncover were all pieces of a puzzle that was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. As his father stood up, he paused and turned to Marcus one last time. Remember this, Marcus. Even in a world where you don't control the rules, you control how you play the game. And the game isn't over yet. The weight of justice. The days following that night felt like they were moving at a different pace, one Marcus wasn't used to. He had always been able to navigate the world with a certain comfort, knowing that his parents were there to guide him, to shield him from the harsh realities that existed outside their doors. But now, everything had shifted. The encounter with Officer Randall had been more than just a troubling interaction. It had cracked open a door to a world of complexities, injustices, and power structures that Marcus wasn't ready to face. And yet, it was a world he now had to understand, because it was his world. His father, Charles, had promised to help him navigate it. But even with his father's wisdom, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the precipice of something far larger than he could comprehend. That morning, as he prepared for school, his mind kept drifting back to the conversation they had had in the kitchen. His father's words haunted him. The game isn't over yet. What game? Marcus wasn't sure, but he was beginning to suspect it was one that he wasn't going to be able to walk away from easily. At school, things felt oddly normal. His friends greeted him, asking about his bike and whether he had ridden it more, but Marcus couldn't focus on their questions. It all felt so trivial, the same chatter about homework and sports, and whatever the latest school drama was. Inside, Marcus was carrying something much heavier, a weight that no one around him seemed to notice. During lunch, he sat at his usual table, but he found himself distracted. He couldn't stop thinking about Officer Randall's face, the way he had looked at him as if he was something less than human. But it wasn't just the officer. Marcus couldn't stop replaying his father's words either. What had his dad meant by the game? And how was Marcus supposed to play it? How was a 14-year-old supposed to carry the burden of understanding something as massive as systemic injustice, and at the same time, try to hold on to the small, fleeting parts of his childhood? His friend James noticed Marcus staring into his half-eaten lunch, his mind clearly elsewhere. "Hey, you okay, man? You seem kind of out of it today." Marcus blinked, snapping out of his thoughts. He gave James a half-hearted smile, trying to push the heaviness away. But the truth was, he didn't feel okay. Not anymore. "Yeah, just tired," Marcus muttered, forcing himself to pick at his food. "Lot on my mind." James raised an eyebrow, but didn't press the issue. "Well, if you're ever down to hang out this weekend, let me know. We could go to the arcade or something. We haven't done that in forever." The offer sounded nice, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that it was all too simple. How could he go to the arcade, laughing with friends, when the world outside seemed to be filled with such harsh truths? How could he enjoy a game of air hockey or a trip to the pizza parlor when there were real battles going on that he wasn't prepared for? The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, and Marcus walked to his next class, his head still heavy with thoughts of his father's cryptic warning. What did Charles mean by "you control how you play the game"? Was his father asking him to become something he wasn't ready to be? Was he supposed to fight back against people like Officer Randall, people who saw him as a threat just because of the color of his skin? Was he meant to stay silent and endure? Or was there something else? A way to challenge the system without losing himself in the process? The thought of challenging the system was daunting. Marcus wasn't naive enough to believe that simply speaking out would make everything better. The system was vast, and the people who controlled it were powerful. He had heard stories of peaceful protests being met with violence, of people who had tried to stand up and were crushed beneath the weight of authority. His father, too, had shared stories of undercover operations, of shadowy networks of power, and how sometimes even the people who claimed to be fighting for justice could be part of the problem. But there was one thing Marcus knew for sure. He wasn't going to let Officer Randall's treatment of him go unchallenged. That much was clear. He couldn't go through life allowing people to diminish his humanity without a fight. If his father was right, then this was just one battle in a much larger war. The next day, after school, Marcus found himself standing outside his house, staring at his bike. The same bike his father had gifted him. A symbol of freedom, of hard work, of trust. It felt heavier now, not because of the bike itself, but because of what it represented. Marcus had been so excited about this birthday gift, but now it felt like a constant reminder of the world's contradictions. It was a tool for freedom, but also a potential target for suspicion. That evening, Charles came home later than usual. Marcus had been sitting in the living room, trying to process everything on his own, but he was still struggling to make sense of it all. He didn't know what his father was thinking, but something told him that this was no longer just about one bad interaction with a cop. It was about understanding the deep currents of power, privilege, and bias that shaped the world they lived in. And if he was going to have any hope of surviving in it, he needed to understand how to move within those currents. Charles stepped inside the door, his briefcase in hand, but his expression was different tonight. More serious, more urgent. Without greeting Marcus, he headed toward the kitchen, placing the briefcase on the counter. Marcus followed him, not sure what to expect. "Dad, what's going on?" Marcus asked, his voice hesitant. Charles turned to face him, his brow furrowing in concentration. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened with Officer Randall. I've spoken to my colleagues at the FBI, and they've been looking into the incident. It turns out Officer Randall has a history. He's been involved in several complaints for racial profiling and excessive force." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected his father to take action so quickly. "What are you going to do about it?" Charles exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I've already put a few things in motion. Randall may not realize it, but the situation is being looked at from several different angles. I'm going to make sure the right people are involved." Marcus felt a surge of relief mixed with confusion. His father's power, the reach he had within the FBI, could change the outcome of this situation. But Marcus still didn't understand something. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner? Why didn't you tell me how deep it went? You knew about Randall." Charles sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Because I didn't want to burden you. I wanted you to be able to enjoy your childhood. But now you're old enough to see what's really happening. You're old enough to understand that this isn't just about one officer or one bad day. It's about a system that's been in place for generations. And it's a system that doesn't just affect you. It affects all of us." Marcus's head spun. His father's work was far more complicated than he had ever realized. The FBI wasn't just about cracking cases and solving crimes. It was about power, who held it, who abused it, and how it trickled down to affect every part of society. "But what happens now, Dad? What am I supposed to do with all of this?" Marcus asked, his voice small, overwhelmed by the weight of everything he was beginning to understand. Charles placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm yet comforting. "You keep fighting, Marcus. You use your voice, your strength, your mind. You don't let people define you by their fears and prejudices. You stand tall, and you fight the battles that matter." For the first time since the incident, Marcus felt like he understood what his father had meant. The fight wasn't just about a single moment of injustice. It was about understanding the systems that caused those moments and learning how to challenge them. He wasn't alone in this fight. His father was there, watching over him, guiding him. And slowly, Marcus began to realize that this was just the beginning of something much larger than he could have ever imagined. But it was a fight he was ready to face. The game, as his father had said, was far from over.